Welcome to Know the Love of Christ. Welcome back. In last week's episode, we discussed Jesus and his disciples having dinner, or supper as it's called in the Bible, at Simon the leper's house. And we figured out that this was Judas's father's house. And then Mary, Lazarus and Martha's sister, anoints Jesus during this time. Judas criticized her. We learned that from John 12, that it's Mary. But Jesus comes to her defense, saying that she has done a good thing, and she has done what she could. Later, they are observing the Passover when Jesus tells them that one of them will betray him. And they're all confused, and they ask him, "Is it I? Is it I?" And then Judas leaves. So today we're going to study Mark chapter 14, 32 through 52. Now the next few episodes are going to be pretty intense because we're coming close to the end of Jesus' life. So be ready, be mentally prepared, pray, because it's going to be a little hard study. All right, so pause the podcast here, read chapter 14, 32 through 52, and then start the podcast back up again and join us in our study. All right, so Jesus has led his disciples out to the Garden of Gethsemane. This was a garden that was near the Mount of Olives. I didn't know this, but doing a little digging and researching, Gethsemane actually means olive oil press. Did you know that?
I read that somewhere.
Did you? I didn't know that. I highly suggest at this point too, reading John 13, starting at verse 31 through chapter 16. All that section of scripture takes place during this time on the Mount of Olives after Judas made the decision to betray Jesus. So those chapters are rich in wisdom and comfort and direction and love. It was a special time for Jesus and his disciples. In Jesus' time of utter anguish, look what he does. He prays. It's like, the Son of God, being stressed and in turmoil, felt that he needed to pray.
What I was thinking about was in 16 and 17. One of the things that struck me is he said what, at least the ESV has, we have those headings that are man-made.
Mm-hmm.
So the man-made heading above chapter 17 in John in the ESV is the high priestly prayer. And he just prays for all these things. And this is before he gets to Gethsemane. Not before he gets to Gethsemane. It's before the betrayal and arrest. Yeah. He's in Gethsemane. Sorry, I said that wrong. But he is like exhorting them and encouraging them. And one of the things that he prays for in that high priestly prayer, in verses 20 through 23 of John 17, he prays for unity for his believers. And I just think about like all that he's going through. And of course, the prayer that we have recorded in Mark, where he prays 3 times and we're going to jump into that. Those prayers, like the very thing that he prays for right before that is that they'll have unity. Unity is so important. And I know, I'm sure we've all heard sermons on unity and the importance of it. And it just kind of goes in one ear and out the other. But he is about to die an excruciating death. He is about to be betrayed by one of his inner circle. And this is the thing, like we know, because hindsight's 20/20 and because we can read it, that Judas betrayed him. We know that from the beginning. Like we learned that early on. We're taught that early on. And Jesus knew it. But this was someone he was close with. Like Jesus isn't like us. Like even though he saw it coming, he's not holding it against Judas. He is loving him. He's treating him like a friend. He's like, no one guessed it. I think we talked about that last time. No one guessed it. No one knew who it was going to be. So it's not like Judas was an outcast or left out or treated like a second-rate, apostle.
Right, yeah.
No, he was treated just like everybody else. And I would say, Jesus obviously loved him just like he loved everybody else. And on the eve of this, knowing how just removing one from the 12 is going to cause chaos, he's praying for cohesion there. And I think about our congregations and how, 1 Corinthians 12 talks about us all working together. And Jesus knows how disruptive it is for one of his inner circle to leave. How much more so in our congregations when we have people coming and going, and, the way that affects things and the makeup of the congregation, and how important it is to have that unity. Sorry, I just went on a big, long rant about unity. But that's one thing that really, probably the thing that stood out the most to me. And it was just something I stumbled across when I was cross-referencing the passages about Jesus' betrayal. And it's not even in the betrayal, it's beforehand.
John 17 is my favorite chapter.
In the whole Bible?
Yeah.
Aww.
Because there's so much to
There
that.
is. It is. We could do a...
Let's do an episode just on that one.
Yeah.
Sure, why not? All right, so verse 33, he brings his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. So he brings the 12 to Gethsemane. Then he brings the 3 even further in with him. Even the perfect man, Jesus, wanted and needed his friends in times of great trouble and deep distress.
Yeah, he wanted comfort.
You think, but he's so perfect, and he's the Son of God, and he's God, and
the strength there.
But he still wanted his friends, his closest friends, with him. I know ESV in verse 34 says very sorrowful, and KJV says exceedingly sorrowful. The original word, I know I'm not going to say this right, but it's peripolos, which is overwhelmingly sorrowful, greatly distressed. We talked about how sometimes it doesn't translate well in English. Right. So in English, it had to be added very sorrowful, right. Exceedingly sorrowful. Whereas if they were reading it in the original language, they would have understood how deeply distressed Jesus was. By itself, it's a more intensified feeling of sorrow than just to read, he felt bad, So he tells them, stay here and watch. Watch wasn't, watch me. It was watch, be on guard, be ready, like he told them, what we studied not too long ago. It was almost like, watch my back. I'm here. I'm so terribly upset and distressed. Just watch my back because it's about to happen. I don't want to feel like I'm alone type of thing. That's awful.
Yeah, so that Greek word you were talking about.
You know more about it?
A little bit.
Okay, good.
I don't know if I'd say more, just kind of an emphasis of that first part of that word, that or peri. It is all-encompassing, surrounding. Which, like you said, it's hard to translate into English just how, there is a richness and a depth there that doesn't come, even with the word very.
Yeah.
I think exceedingly does a good job in KJV. I really do, because, ESV does just say very sorrowful. Very. It's just kind of womp womp. But also on the end of that, the background commentary that I read mentioned that it would have been really late here. Mm-hmm. And so we're coming into this, and like you said, he's saying, watch my back, but it's really late at night for this culture. So what it said is that it was probably 10 or 11, which for me is not late. I'm a night owl. But hold on. I'm going to hold off on that until we get just a little bit further. Okay. But it is late. Just remember it's late.
Okay. Well, 35 and 36, he praises his Father, even in turmoil. He knows he came to do the Father's will, because he says so in John 6:38. But he fell on his face and prayed that if it were possible, the hour may pass from him. He knew it couldn't pass from him, but he prayed it anyway. But to fall on his face, he was just, there's no English word to describe it. It's I would say, I was just utterly stressed out, or
Drained.
I was at wit's end. Yeah, drained, or it just to fall.
Dejected.
Yeah, to feel like there's no way out of this.
Right, and he had perfect knowledge. He knew.
Ugh.
I don't know. Some people know that, and I know I've heard it before, but that word Abba right there is an intimate word. And so for those of you who don't know, that is, it's more than just like father. It's like daddy, and so there's an intimacy that's portrayed there. And from the background commentary, it said, that's normally the first word a child would even utter. But sometimes adults would use it for their fathers as well. But just an interesting little side note.
Yeah. Before we get to 37 through 39, Luke 22:44 is a good description too, because it says, "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." I have never been that stressed.
Oh, no.
I can't ever say I've been that stressed. And that is a medical condition. And it's interesting that Luke, the physician, records it.
Yeah.
That is blood pressure was so intense. His stress was so intense that he literally, like the capillaries right under the skin, I forget what they call it, but the capillaries right under the skin burst so that it seeps through the skin. So it looks as if he's sweating blood.
Oh, wow.
So when it said that, his sweat was like great drops of blood, it was because he was under so much agony, as Luke describes it.
Yeah, and can you imagine going into what he's about to go through and for his blood pressure to be that high?
Mm-hmm.
Like that would feel like you'd feel physically sick beforehand. Like you would feel awful.
And like maybe that's why he fell to the ground, and it just...
I don't know. But it's an interesting thought.
So 37 through 39, when it talks about, well, when he was praying, it wasn't the, we see these art depictions of this light-skinned, blue-eyed, straight-haired Jesus looking all, just with his sad puppy dog eyes. It wasn't that. No. I mean, he was in utter
agony.
Yeah. And so he came back and found them sleeping. And he says, "Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour?" So he had already been praying for an hour. Interesting that he goes straight to Peter.
Oh, yeah, I have notes about that.
Do you? Yes, like, "Peter, I'll die for you, but
yes, that's exactly. Yeah, you go back to verses 29 through 31, and that's what Peter says. Like, even if the rest leave, I will never. Oh, not me. And then he calls him out specifically here. He's like, "Oh, you're sleeping? You're going to die for me?" He doesn't say you're going to die for me, but I'm sure. Right. I'm not sure. In my mind, that's how it's going. Like, oh, you were going to go to death for me, but you can't even stay awake for an hour. And what I found in the Bible background commentary that I got excited about earlier. So it said that it was customary to stay awake on the night of Passover.
Oh, really?
Yeah, not like all night. It was customary to stay awake late. So this wouldn't have been the first time they stayed up late. It said that they had likely nearly stayed up every Passover of their lives.
That makes sense.
Yeah, which, I mean, in my mind, Passover is not Christmas.
Oh, no,
but I'm thinking about, stuff like that. It's hard to go to sleep. Just kind of the excitement and the buzz that would have been there just from this being somewhat of it's a celebration. They're celebrating the Exodus.
Right. Being delivered.
And God's redemption, like it said. And so even just culturally speaking, that would have been somewhat of a high. And so they are with Jesus, and they should be on somewhat of a high, and they're passed out.
Yeah. And he finds them sleeping, yet he calls out Peter too.
Right, because Peter was the one that opened his mouth
right.
earlier.
Our brother.
Yes.
So in verse 40, I forgot to read 38. It's like he says, "Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit truly is ready, but the flesh is weak." Interesting, because his flesh right now is weak. He's sweating drops of blood, and, he's probably, like you said, feeling sick to his stomach, and he's falling down in anguish, and so his flesh is weak, but his spirit stays strong, and it's ready.
Right, and I do think here that he's also pointing out for us that, Peter is saying these things. He truly, his intent is pure there. At that point, he's saying, your spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak. But he's saying, Peter, you are willing. You say these things and you truly mean them. Yes, you are willing to go to death. But your flesh, on the other hand.
Yeah. And it's temptation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, so verse 39, he goes away and he prays again. He spoke the same words. And when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy and they did not know what to answer him. They didn't understand the urgent need to watch and pray. Like, they didn't truly understand. Yeah, they knew Jesus was going to die because he's told them, but
they didn't grasp it.
Yeah.
They don't until it's already done.
Yeah, and they don't know it's happening right now.
I mean, at the point of the betrayal, from then on up until they see him again. But they, he has this utter sorrow and anguish. And then he, gets that second wind, I guess you could say. He's got the strength to go through it all. And they are anguished from that point forward. And it's just, not woe is me, but this is the end of our world. We thought this man was the Messiah and he's dead. And they just don't get it till they see him again.
I can't help but to feel for him.
Oh, yeah.
Because, if you apply that to us today, we'll die for you, but we rest in either our ignorance or our contentment of our situation, or, it's applicable to us too.
Oh, yeah, and the sorrowfulness too. Past the point where we look at events in our lives and we don't understand how the circumstances are piecing together to turn into Romans 8:28. Right. And we're like, this is awful. Mm-hmm. How are we going to make it through this? How is this trial ever going to be anything other than, a horrible, dark hour in my life? And we've all heard preachers say that. Most of us, at least the two of us in this room, I think, have heard them say, the darkest hour in history is also the one filled with the most hope and light because it brought us salvation, and in our own lives, it'll never be the brightest hour. But a lot of times you look back at your darkest hours and they produce light and hope.
All right, so verses 41 and 42, he comes a third time and he finds them resting and sleeping, is what he asks them. Are you sleeping and resting? And he says, it is enough. So the hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. This would be the last time that they're on the Mount of Olives.
Well, that would have been pivotal for them too, honestly. Because as we're told throughout Scripture, that was a custom for Jesus, for them to be there so much. And this would have been the last time that they were there with him, right?
Yeah.
Up until he ascends.
Yeah.
Do they go back? I'm trying to think. Once he resurrects, do they go back before he ascends? So this is the last time they're there before they come back. And then he leaves them for a second time.
So basically, he's saying that it's enough. You've had enough rest, and they don't have any more rest after this. If you think about it. For basically the rest of their lives, they don't have rest. So when he says it is enough, it's enough.
He literally means it. That's enough. All right.
That's enough. My betrayer is at hand. Wow, I never thought about that, because they really do live the rest of their lives. They turn in the world upside down. So 43 through 49, in your Bible, it might be subtitled Betrayal and Arrest in Gethsemane. I highly suggest comparing all four Gospels when reading this, because I noticed in John's account, he mentions troops with him, but he has here, Mark has a great multitude. John has and troops. They come with swords and clubs and torches. So like you said, it's late. Jesus exposed his betrayer to his disciples at this point because they didn't know. When he said, one of y'all is going to betray me, none of them knew. They were like, who is it? Who is it? Is who dips the bread with me? But none of them really knew. And it isn't until right now when he exposes who his betrayer is. And they all four accounts name him. And the worst of it all, in Matthew's account, Matthew 26:50, Jesus says, "Friend, why have you come?" I was like, oh. Even being betrayed, he calls him friend.
Well, I mean, in Mark, it says that Jesus calls him rabbi.
Teacher, which is respectful.
Teacher, yeah, it is. It is. And in the Jewish community, it would have been it just churned your stomach.
Mm-hmm. And to do it with a kiss.
Right. But don't we do the same in our own lives? I mean, hopefully not every day, but I mean, don't we have moments in our lives? I'm totally getting emotional over here. So I apologize. Don't we have moments in our lives where we kiss the Savior and completely
betray him
all at the same time, where we're clinging to him? I mean, I highly doubt it was a little peck while I stay up in the distance. Like, he would have had to have been close to him. I imagine him grabbing his shoulders, and leaning in. And I think about the times in my life where I've done that, and like how someone I know likes to use the phrase wormy, how wormy that makes me feel. Like, just how low and awful when I think about it past the occurrence of it, whatever it is, because we don't physically touch and kiss Jesus, obviously, but sometimes we cling to him and pretend like we're his friend, and we're betraying him all in the same breath.
That's awful.
It's heavy stuff.
It is. I mean, because it's so, we can relate to it. Like, you're getting all emotional over here. It's because we do the same, know?
It just doesn't seem as bad.
Because we're not face to face
with them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we'd like to think, oh, I'd never. And we totally do it. And Jesus, in his graciousness and amazingness and magnanimousness, if that's a word,
that's love.
Us. Yeah, loves us and calls us friend and allows it to happen and takes us back when we come back. And that's the thing. That's probably the saddest part of Judas's story. He could have come back from this.
Yep.
And that's the difference in the penitent heart. Like I said, that weakness of character. And we look at people like David, and David was forever changed after Bathsheba. Mm-hmm. But we see that same anguish and that depth of sorrow in the Psalms. What is it, Psalm 51?
Mm-hmm.
Where he repents. And we look at Judas's repentance. He tries to make it right, kind of weakly. And it's like, which one do we want to be? I hope I'm choosing the right one.
Right. Okay.
Moving on.
Yeah. All right, so 47, and one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. We know from John's account, John 18:10, who is it?
It's
Peter.
John just really likes to harp on Peter.
Well, he was there, He
does, but he calls him out a lot.
He does. But Peter, he went in for the kill shot.
Oh, yeah.
He was going in.
Like you said before, spirit's willing. Oh, he is willing.
And you can't help but to think Malchus was like, whoa. Yeah. And moved on. And he just, cut off his ear. In Matthew's account, Jesus rebukes Peter for the last time, reminding him of his divinity and humanity. So if you read in Matthew 26:52 through 54, listen to this. He said, and Jesus said to him, put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus? A legion is approximately 6,000 soldiers. 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers. From this point on, it's human Jesus. It's not the God Jesus. Now, I don't mean to say that he gave up his divinity or anything like that, but the human side of him
is what's on display here.
Is on display, and because of that, we have salvation. Right. Because if the God part of him did call 12 legions of angels, we wouldn't have salvation today, because the earth would have been destroyed, basically.
And we know from like Matthew 4 that was a temptation for him. That's one of the temptations that Satan provoked him with. And so we know the human side of him was tempted to do that.
Well, the human side of him was tempted from here on out.
Yeah.
But it was the human side of him that said,
each step of the process went further and further. That's the thing. You think about it, and, at the beginning of different, like, physical things that happen, you're ready, you're willing to go, and you think about, like, marathon runners. And it's like, you can't give up in the last mile. You can't give up in the last mile. But so many people never make it to that last mile because it's so hard. And that's just a marathon. This is not,
right, yeah.
An excruciating, physical, torturing, and then murder.
Right. So he shows complete submissiveness to the Father's will and complete power to resist temptation. Because since I was a young Christian, I never considered the temptation at this point. Like, I don't know why. I just never. Jesus was tempted in all points. Okay, yeah. The bread, the kingdom, the 3 temptations you read about. Oh, yeah, okay. But really, he was tempted throughout his whole life, but yet is completely submissive to his Father's will. And now, in Luke's account, the physician, it's the last recorded miracle. He heals Malchus's ear, and that's it. That's the last of his divinity. He heals the poor man's ear. He's about to be taken away by this person. Yeah. And he's like, let me fix his ear. Oh, no. I'm so unworthy. Yeah, verse 50. Then they all forsook him and fled. Mm-hmm. How sad.
Stay with you to the death, but I can't stay awake, and I'm not going to stick around.
Right. I cut off this man's ear, so bye.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. Now, 51 through 52, these 2 verses is only recorded in Mark. And it's commonly believed to be Mark. Did you know that? A bunch of commentaries, even ancient commentaries, I guess you could call it ancient historians, believe it's Mark. And they also believe, if in fact it was Mark, that the Passover, when he up in the large upper room, that it was Mark's mother's house, because she was considered wealthy. Historically, there's some evidence of something that she's... and plus, she had, later on, you read in Acts, I think 12, where she had a whole bunch of people at her house. And so they thinking that she had a large house, and so she was wealthy.
That's really interesting, because something I read, I don't know if I brought this up with the other episode that we had where we were talking about him telling them to go out to them and find a man who was carrying water. Remember, did we talk about that and the significance of that? Mm-hmm. And how it wasn't usual for a man to carry water. That would have been a woman's job. And if it was a wealthy woman who owned that house, I just think, as a woman wanting to treat women right and not feel like I'm subjecting other women to things that I wouldn't want to do. Anyway, it's just interesting.
Yeah. Now, the word there for linen, I think it was linen cloth thrown about his naked body. The linen cloth, that original word is sindon, S-I-N-D-O-N, sindon. It was a very costly piece of clothing. It wasn't just, a blanket thrown around him. It was considered a costly garment. And so if this was Mark's mother, who lived in Jerusalem, and she was wealthy and offered her home, they think maybe when Jesus and his disciples left after supper, that Mark may have slipped his sindon, or whatever, however you pronounce it, on and went along with them, as far as with the disciples, the apostles. But obviously was not one of the apostles that was one of the young men, because apostles would not have owned this expensive piece of cloth, this clothing. So it was obviously an outsider that knew them enough to go with them, but that's just one of the theories. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but it's interesting that it's recorded in Mark, and it's explained in such a unusual way.
I know, and it seems so weird. Like it's just a little snippet. Yeah. So
it was almost like he's saying, I was there.
Maybe.
Almost. That's all, theory, but we can ask when we get to heaven. But I think really the whole point of that, personally, I believe that the whole point of it is the cost of discipleship. When it gets difficult, are you going to just drop everything and go and leave and flee? It's just not worth it. It's like a cost of discipleship. Okay.
Snippet there.
Well, that brings us to our question. And where do you find the love of Christ?
All right. So I see it there in 43 through 50, where he's betrayed, because like I said, I feel like I identify that with Judas there somewhat. I try really hard to live my life so that I don't identify with Judas much, but I am human, so I do. And so I see it in the fact that, Jesus still, he didn't call him out beforehand. He didn't do anything. He just stood there and let it happen. And then, like we said from the other account, he called him friend, But on top of that, Jesus was willing to stand there and let it happen so that we can really be his friend and be reconciled to him past the part where we betray him. So
I find it in the humanity of Christ, how it took over from the garden to his death. Like all the temptations from the garden onward just shows his love. Philippians 2:8 says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. And the cross was considered like it was capital punishment for the worst of the worst, and he wasn't. He really does understand our temptations. He understands everything that we go through, which doesn't seem like it's possible. It's like, no, my situation's different. No, it's not. He understands it completely and still sacrificed himself. Verse 38, when he calls them out for sleeping, to me, is like the spirit truly is ready, but the flesh is weak. To me, it was an encouragement. Like, you can do this. Look, I'm about to do the worst of the worst for you.
The heavy lifting, yeah. Well, that does it for this episode. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. If you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us on social media or through that email that we've been telling y'all about. It should be linked in the comments. If you'd like to study, we would love to connect you to someone local, or if you're local to us, of course, we'd love to study with you. And as always, we hope that you'll seek to know the love of Christ in your own life. Until next time.
You can reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram. We would love to hear from you. And be sure to click like and share this episode with family and friends. In doing so, you're sharing the love of Christ.